Morgan Fletcher woke to the sound of rain against the castle windows. Not the gentle, pattering sort of rain that might lull someone back to sleep, but the insistent, drumming kind that seemed determined to be heard. It matched the rhythm of Morgan's heart. Quick, anxious, relentless. For a moment, lying in the warmth of the four-poster bed with its heavy curtains drawn, Morgan considered simply staying there, pretending to be ill, missing defense against the dark arts entirely. But that was ridiculous, cowardly even. Morgan pushed back the curtains and sat up, feet finding the cold stone floor. The dormitory was already stirring with morning activity. Across the room, Hannah Abbott was braiding her hair with practiced efficiency, humming something under her breath. Susan Bones rummaged through her trunk, muttering about misplaced quills. Ernie Macmillan's voice carried from the boys' dormitory above, holding forth about something with his usual confidence. Normal. Everything was perfectly normal. Except today was the day Professor Lupin would be teaching them about Boggart. The rumor had spread through Hogwarts like fiendfire over the past week. Third years had been insufferably smug about it, dropping hints in the corridors and common rooms. "Wait until you lot face a Boggart," they'd say with knowing grins. "Really shows you what you're made of." Some had offered advice. Think of something funny quickly. Don't hesitate. Keep your wand steady. Others had simply laughed, as if remembering some private joke at the second year's expense. Morgan had tried not to think about it, had tried to focus on transfiguration essays and the herbology assignments and the upcoming Quidditch match between Gryffindor and Slytherin. But the knowledge sat in the stomach like a cold stone, growing heavier each day. Today. It was happening today. "You're quiet this morning," Hannah observed, glancing over with friendly concern. Hannah was like that, perpetually kind, attuned to shifts in mood, the way Professor Sprout was attuned to plants needing water. "Just tired," Morgan managed, pulling on the yellow-trimmed robes that marked them as Hufflepuff. The fabric felt heavier than usual, or perhaps that was just imagination. "Big day, though, isn't it?" Susan joined the conversation, finally locating her quill and stuffing it into her bag with satisfaction. "Defense this afternoon. Boggarts. There it was. Spoken aloud. Made real." "I've been trying to figure out what mine will be," Susan continued, oblivious to the way Morgan's hands had frozen while fastening robes. "Spiders, probably. Or maybe failing my OWLS, though that's ages away still. What about you, Morgan? What do you reckon yours will be?" The question hung in the air like a jinx waiting to land. Morgan had thought about little else for days, had lain awake at night, cataloguing fears like inventory in a shop. Fear of heights? No. Flying lessons had been fine. Fear of magical creatures? The hippogriff lesson had been nerve-wracking but manageable. Fear of embarrassment? That was every student's constant companion, hardly Boggart-worthy. But there were other fears, deeper ones, the kind that whispered in the dark spaces between waking and sleep. Fear of disappointing everyone who'd ever believed in them. Fear of discovering they didn't belong here, in this magical world that still felt impossibly wonderful and terrifyingly new. Fear of being alone, truly alone, in a way that had nothing to do with whether people were physically present. "Don't know," Morgan said finally, managing to sound casual. "Guess we'll find out." Hannah shot Susan a look, one of those quick, communicative glances that close friends shared. Professor Lupin's Supposed to be brilliant at teaching this, she offered gently. My cousin had him last year. Said he made everyone feel safe, even when they were scared. Safe. What a strange word to use about facing one's deepest fear made manifest. The Hufflepuff common room was warm and bustling when they descended from the dormitories. Low-ceilinged and cozy, it always reminded Morgan of a favourite room in a beloved home, the kind of place where light came golden through round windows and the air smelled faintly of earth and growing things. House elves had been through already. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, and the chairs bore fresh cushions in yellow and black. Several older students clustered near the notice board, arguing good-naturedly about Hogsmeade weekend. A group of first years practiced wand movements in the corner, their faces scrunched in concentration. Everything felt reassuringly ordinary, except Morgan couldn't shake the weight in their chest. The walk to the Great Hall took them through the usual route, up the stone steps, past the portrait of the singing sorceress, who was working through scales this morning, along the corridor where armor stood sentinel and occasionally shifted with metallic creaks. Hogwarts in October was a study in contrasts. Cold stone warmed by magical fire, ancient architecture alive with movement, silence broken by distant voices, and the ever-present sounds of a castle full of young witches and wizards learning their craft. The Great Hall was organized chaos, as it always was at breakfast time. 4 long house tables stretched beneath the enchanted ceiling, which today reflected the storm raging outside, dark clouds roiling, rain falling that never quite reached the students below. Candles floated overhead, their flames steady despite the spectral wind. The smell of porridge, toast, bacon, and pumpkin juice mingled with the scent of wet stone from students who'd braved the grounds despite the weather. Morgan followed Hannah and Susan to the Hufflepuff table, sliding onto the bench between them. Ernie Macmillan was already holding court further down, explaining something about the proper wand grip for shield charms to anyone who would listen. Justin Finch-Fletchley nodded along, occasionally interjecting questions that seemed designed more to encourage Ernie than from genuine curiosity. "Pass the toast, would you?" Susan asked, reaching for the marmalade. Morgan complied automatically, then stared down at an empty plate. The thought of eating made their stomach twist. Across the hall, the Gryffindor table erupted in laughter. Something about a prank involving a fanged frisbee and Percy Weasley, from what Morgan could catch. The Ravenclaws at their table were bent over books even during breakfast, stealing bites between paragraphs. The Slytherins maintained their usual air of calculated composure, though Morgan caught sight of some second years who looked as nervous as they felt. So it wasn't just Hufflepuffs facing Boggarts today. That should have been comforting somehow. Shared misery and all that. "You need to eat something," Hannah said quietly, nudging a basket of muffins closer. "Can't face a Boggart on an empty stomach. That's just asking for trouble." "Is that official magical wisdom, or are you just being motherly again?" Morgan asked, but accepted a muffin anyway. The blueberry ones were always good. House elves had a particular talent with baking. "Both," Hannah replied with a small smile. "My mum always says fear feels worse when you're hungry. Something about blood sugar and courage being related." Morgan managed a weak laugh and took a bite. The muffin was delicious, as expected, but tasted like ash in their mouth. The morning crawled by with agonizing slowness, herbology first, in the greenhouses where Professor Sprout had them repotting bouncing bulbs. The work required concentration. The bulbs were aptly named and prone to escaping their pots with enthusiastic leaps. But even the challenge of wrestling magical plants couldn't fully distract from the looming afternoon. Morgan's bulb seemed to sense the distraction, making a break for freedom and bouncing merrily around the greenhouse, until Justin managed to catch it in a conjured net. "Well done, Mr. Finch-Fletchley," Professor Sprout called out. 10 points to Hufflepuff for quick thinking. "And Mr. Fletcher," she added, turning to Morgan with keen eyes that missed nothing, "do try to keep your attention on the task at hand. These bulbs can be mischievous when they sense a wandering mind." Morgan nodded, cheeks warm, and managed to get the bulb secured in fresh soil. Professor Sprout moved on, but not before giving Morgan's shoulder a brief, reassuring pat. It was the kind of gesture she excelled at. Brief enough not to embarrass, firm enough to convey genuine care. Transfiguration followed, up in the castle proper where Professor McGonagall maintained her usual exacting standards. They were working on turning beetles into buttons, a deceptively simple-sounding task that required precise wand work and clear visualization. Morgan's beetle stubbornly retained its legs even after multiple attempts, resulting in a rather disturbing button that skittered across the desk whenever touched. "Concentrate, Fletcher," Professor McGonagall said, swooping past with her characteristic efficiency. "The transformation is only as complete as your focus allows. A scattered mind produces scattered magic. Easier said than done when that scattered mind kept circling back to wardrobes and shape-shifting creatures, and the question of what form personal terror might take. Lunch was a subdued affair. Morgan picked at shepherd's pie, while conversation flowed around them. Susan and Hannah had been joined by several other Hufflepuff second years. Wayne Hopkins, who was nervous about the upcoming potions essay. Megan Jones, who wanted to discuss the Quidditch standings. And Eleanor Branstone, who had apparently heard from her older brother that Boggart sometimes malfunctioned and became stuck in silly forms, which seemed too optimistic to be true. "I heard Professor Lupin brings them out one at a time," Wayne was saying, pushing peas around his plate. "So the whole class watches each person face their Boggart." Individually, that was somehow worse than Morgan had imagined. Not just facing the fear itself, but doing so while 20-odd classmates observed, having one's deepest terror made public spectacle. That's the point, though, isn't it? Ernie had wandered over, unable to resist the opportunity to explain. The ridiculous charm only works if you can imagine something funny. Having other people there helps. Their laughter actually weakens the Boggart. It's quite clever magic, really. Communal defense. "Easy for you to say," Megan muttered. "You're good at everything." Ernie had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I'm sure I'll be just as nervous as everyone else when it's my turn." Fear doesn't really care about grades, does it? That, at least, was true. Morgan had seen Ernie genuinely frightened during the business with the Chamber of Secrets last year, when Muggleborns were being attacked and everyone walked the corridors with wary eyes. Fear was remarkably democratic in its distribution. The afternoon arrival felt both too soon and like something Morgan had been anticipating for years. Defense against the dark arts was held on the first floor. In a classroom that had seen its share of unusual teachers, Professor Lupin had transformed the space since taking over, removed the garish decorations of Lockhart's tenure, cleared away Quirrell's lingering smell of garlic, made it into something practical and welcoming. Desks were pushed to the sides today, leaving an open space in the center. And there, against the far wall, stood a wardrobe. It rattled. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like something restless shifting inside. Several students jumped. Morgan's heart, already racing, seemed to stumble over itself. Come in, Professor Lupin called cheerfully from near his desk. Don't be shy. We've got exciting work today. He looked, as always, somewhat shabby and entirely kind. His robes were patched at the elbows, his face lined with premature age, but his eyes held a warmth that made even the rattling wardrobe seem less threatening. He waited until all the students had filed in, Hufflepuffs and Ravenclaws together for this lesson, before moving to stand beside the wardrobe. Now then, he began, one hand resting casually on the wardrobe door as if to reassure it, or perhaps to reassure them. Who can tell me what creature we're dealing with today? Hands shot up. Ernie's, predictably. Several Ravenclaws. Professor Lupin pointed to Padma Patil. A Boggart, Professor. A shapeshifter that takes the form of whatever the person facing it fears most. Excellent. 5 points to Ravenclaw. Lupin smiled. Boggarts are indeed shapeshifters, and fairly common ones at that. They like dark, enclosed spaces, wardrobes, the gap beneath beds, cupboards under stairs. Left alone, they're relatively harmless. But when confronted, he paused meaningfully. They become something else entirely, something personal. The wardrobe rattled again, harder this time. Morgan flinched. The spell to repel a Boggart is simple, Lupin continued. Ridiculous. But the magic isn't in the words alone. It's in what you do with them. Can anyone tell me the theory behind this particular charm? This time, Susan's hand went up. You have to imagine the thing you fear becoming something funny. The laughter weakens the Boggart. Precisely. 10 points to Hufflepuff. Lupin's expression grew more serious. Fear is powerful magic. It can freeze us, silence us, make us forget everything we've learned. But laughter, genuine laughter, is a different kind of power entirely. It transforms fear into something manageable. That's what we're here to practice today. He demonstrated the wand movement, a quick upward flick accompanied by the incantation. The class repeated it, a chorus of ridiculous that sounded almost silly in the empty air. Almost, but not quite. There was tension underneath, like a string pulled too tight. Excellent, Lupin said, though several wand movements had been decidedly wobbly. Now, I'm going to ask you to form a line. Each of you will step forward, face the Boggart, and cast the charm. Remember, the Boggart feeds on fear, but laughter starves it. Trust yourselves. Trust your magic. He made it sound so simple. The line formed with a mixture of eagerness and reluctance. Ernie positioned himself near the front, naturally. Several Ravenclaws jockeyed for position, wanting to go first and get it over with. The more nervous students gravitated toward the middle, hoping for time to prepare, but not wanting to be last. Morgan found themselves near the back, heart hammering, palms slick with sweat. Through the crowd of students, they could still see the wardrobe, still hear it rattling, still feel the weight of approaching fear. Professor Lupin took his position to the side, wand ready. Remember, he said, making eye contact with each student in turn, whatever you see, it's just a Boggart. It cannot truly hurt you. The only power it has is the power your fear gives it. His gaze lingered on Morgan for just a moment, warm, understanding, somehow knowing. Then he raised his wand toward the wardrobe, and the lesson began. The wardrobe door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through every bone in Morgan's body. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The dark interior of the wardrobe remained just that, dark, empty, waiting. Then something shifted in the shadows, something that didn't quite have a shape yet, and the air in the classroom changed. It grew heavier, colder, like the moment before a storm breaks. Professor Lupin stood with his wand raised, perfectly still, perfectly calm. "Now," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a warming charm through winter chill. "Before we begin, I want you all to understand exactly what we're dealing with." He gestured toward the wardrobe, and the shapeless thing inside seemed to recoil slightly, as if responding to his attention. This creature has existed for as long as wizardkind has experienced fear. Boggarts are mentioned in texts dating back to the 14th century, though they're certainly older than that. They're not particularly intelligent. They can't reason, can't be bargained with, can't be trained. They have one function: to become fear itself. A girl near the front, one of the Ravenclaws, Lisa Turpin, raised her hand tentatively. "Professor, how does it know what we're afraid of?" "Excellent question." 5 points to Ravenclaw. Lupin's expression grew thoughtful. "We don't entirely know. The prevailing theory is that Boggarts possess a form of crude legilimency, mind reading, for those unfamiliar with the term. But unlike a skilled wizard who can sift through thoughts and memories with precision, a Boggart simply senses. It feels the fear radiating from whoever stands before it and shapes itself accordingly." He began to pace slowly, his shabby robes swishing softly against the stone floor. The movement seemed calculated to draw attention away from the wardrobe, to remind them that there was still a teacher here, still safety, still control. "The fascinating thing about Boggarts," Lupin continued, "is that they reveal something profoundly personal. Not necessarily our worst fear, mind you, but often our most immediate one. The fear sitting closest to the surface of our consciousness." He paused, making eye contact with various students. "Which means what you see today might be entirely different from what you'd see a year from now, or what you saw a year ago." Morgan felt a flutter of something, not quite hope, but perhaps a loosening of the knot in their chest. The idea that fears changed, that they weren't permanent fixtures, was oddly comforting. "Now, the ridiculous charm," Lupin said, and with a subtle flick of his wand, the word appeared in glowing letters in the air above him. "It's categorized as a defensive charm, though I've always thought it was more of a transformative one. You're not banishing the Boggart, you see. You're not fighting it in the traditional sense. You're recontextualizing it." Several students looked confused. Ernie's hand shot up. "Yes, Mr. Macmillan?" "Sir, what exactly do you mean by recontextualizing?" "I mean," Lupin said with a slight smile, "that you're changing the context in which you experience your fear, taking it from terrifying to absurd. The Boggart itself doesn't actually change. It's still the same creature, but your perception of it does. And since Boggarts are essentially living manifestations of perception, that change becomes real." He waved his wand again, and the glowing letters rearranged themselves into a simple diagram. Fear, arrow, Laughter, arrow, weakness. This is the principle we're working with. The Boggart draws strength from your fear, your racing heart, your sharp breathing, your widened eyes. All of that feeds it, makes it more solid, more real. But laughter does the opposite. Laughter is fundamentally incompatible with fear. You cannot be truly afraid and truly laughing at the same moment. So when you transform your fear into something ridiculous, when you allow yourself to laugh at it, you cut off the Boggart's power source. Morgan watched the diagram shimmer in the air, trying to commit the logic to memory. It made sense, theoretically. But theory and practice were different countries entirely, and Morgan wasn't sure they had the proper passport for the journey between them. "Let me demonstrate," Lupin said suddenly. "Not with the Boggart in the wardrobe. That would be rather unfair to whoever goes first. But I want you to practice the mental transformation before you attempt the magical one." He moved to stand in the center of the cleared space. "I want each of you to think of something that frightens you. Nothing too deep. We're not in therapy session." A few nervous laughs rippled through the class. "Just something simple. A spider, perhaps. Or heights. Or—" He glanced at a fourth-year Ravenclaw who'd wandered in to observe. "Receiving a howler from your mother." The fourth-year grimaced, and genuine laughter bubbled up from the class. Morgan felt their lips twitch, despite everything. "Good," Lupin said approvingly. "Now, close your eyes. Picture that fear as clearly as you can. Make it real in your mind." Morgan closed their eyes obediently. The fear that surfaced wasn't simple. It was the complicated, tangled thing they'd been avoiding all morning. But they tried to give it shape, standing alone in an empty corridor, calling out with no one answering. The horrible certainty of isolation settling like frost on skin. "Now," Lupin's voice continued, gentle but firm. "Imagine something absurd happening to that fear. Perhaps your spider is suddenly wearing roller skates. Perhaps the height you feared has become a bouncy castle. Perhaps that howler explodes into a shower of flowers and sings opera instead of shouting. A spider on roller skates." The image was so ridiculous that despite everything, despite the weight in Morgan's chest and the approaching terror of facing the actual Boggart, a small laugh escaped. Not a big one, barely more than an exhale, but real nonetheless. "There," Lupin said, and Morgan opened their eyes to find the professor smiling. "That's the magic we're cultivating today. Not wand work, not incantations, but imagination. The ability to look at something terrible and say, 'No, I refuse to let you have this power over me. You're absurd, and I'm going to prove it.'" He moved back toward the wardrobe, which had been rattling intermittently throughout his explanation, as if impatient. "The wand movement is simple. I'll demonstrate again. Watch carefully." He raised his wand, a fluid motion that started low and swept upward in a gentle arc. "Ridiculous." The word had a peculiar cadence, almost playful. The emphasis is on the second syllable, ridiculous, and the wand movement should feel light, almost like you're tossing something into the air. Laughter rises, you see. Fear sinks. We want rising magic. The class practiced together, 20 wands sweeping upward in varying degrees of coordination. "Ridiculous! Ridiculous!" The word filled the room, and with each repetition, it did start to sound slightly less serious. How could you take a spell seriously when it contained the word ridiculous right in its pronunciation? "Excellent," Lupin said after several rounds of practice. "Much better. I can see you're getting the feel of it. Remember, It's not about power. You don't need to shout or force the magic. You just need clarity of intention and a genuine moment of seeing your fear as something laughable. Wayne Hopkins raised his hand. But Professor, what if we can't think of anything funny? What if our mind goes blank? It was the question Morgan had been afraid to ask, but desperately needed answered. Lupin's expression softened with understanding. That's the most common difficulty, Mr. Hopkins, and perfectly normal. Fear has a way of crowding out everything else, doesn't it? Your mind becomes very focused, very narrow. That's a survival instinct, useful when facing actual danger, less useful when facing a Boggart. He leaned against his desk, the picture of casual competence. If you find yourself freezing, here's what I want you to do. First, breathe. Sounds simple, but you'd be surprised how many people forget. Second, look at the Boggart and ask yourself one question. What would make this silly? Not funny necessarily, silly. What small detail could I change that would make this absurd? He counted off on his fingers. Ridiculous clothing is always effective. Unexpected sounds. Imagine your fear speaking in a squeaky voice or singing show tunes. Size changes work well too. Make something large impossibly small, or vice versa. Animals are excellent for this. Add floppy ears, give it wheels, dress it in a tutu. More genuine laughter now. Morgan felt the tight band around their chest loosen another notch. A tutu. Anything could wear a tutu, really, and anything wearing a tutu was at least 10% less terrifying by default. The beauty of the ridiculous charm, Lupin continued, warming to his subject, is that there's no right answer. What strikes you as funny might not work for someone else, and that's perfectly fine. The Boggart responds to your perception, your imagination. It's actually quite a personal piece of magic. Padma Patil's twin sister, Parvati, raised her hand. What happens if the charm doesn't work? If the Boggart doesn't change? Then I step in, Lupin said simply. That's why I'm here. I'm not going to let any of you struggle alone with this. If you cast the charm and nothing happens, take a breath and try again. If it still doesn't work, I'll intervene, and we'll move on to the next person. There's no shame in finding something difficult. Magic isn't about being perfect. It's about learning. He pushed away from the desk, standing straight. However, I should mention that most of you will succeed. Do you know why? Because you're all far more capable than you think you are. Every single one of you has already performed magic more complex than this. You've transfigured objects, brewed potions, mastered levitation charms. You've done remarkable things. This is just one more. Morgan wanted to believe him, wanted to feel that confidence that seemed to flow from Professor Lupin like warmth from a fire. But doubt was a stubborn creature, one that didn't respond well to reassurance. Right then, Lupin said, moving to stand beside the wardrobe again. His wand was ready, his posture alert, but not tense. A few final technical points before we begin. The Boggart will emerge and immediately transform based on whoever is standing directly in front of it. The transformation happens quickly. Don't be alarmed. Once you've cast the ridiculous charm successfully, the Boggart will change into your imagined form. At that moment, I want you to laugh. Really laugh, if you can manage it. That will weaken it further. He glanced around the room, making sure everyone was following. After you've had your turn, step back and join your classmates. The Boggart will shift its attention to the next person in line and transform again. We'll continue until everyone has had an opportunity to face it. Questions? Hands rose tentatively. Yes, Miss Branstone. What if two people have the same fear? Does it get confused? Good question. 5 points to Hufflepuff. No, Boggarts are actually quite efficient at shifting between fears when facing multiple people. It can be rather disorienting to watch. The poor thing gets rather confused when faced with a large group, which is actually part of why we practice this in a classroom setting. Confusion weakens it. Mr. Finch-Fletchley. Sir, you said Boggarts can't really hurt us, but what about the fear itself? Can fear hurt us? Lupin's expression grew more serious. That's a very mature question, Justin. Yes, fear itself can be harmful, not in the way a curse can harm, but psychologically. However, that's precisely why we're doing this in a controlled environment. You're facing your fears with 20 of your peers present, with me here to help, in a classroom you know is safe. We're building a foundation of courage in a place where the risks are minimal. Think of it as emotional training. He smiled slightly. Besides, there's something quite liberating about looking at your deepest fear and realizing it can wear a tutu. The laughter that followed was more relaxed now. Morgan could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere. Still nervous, still apprehensive, but no longer quite so oppressive. Professor Lupin had done that somehow, made the impossible seem merely difficult, made the terrifying seem approachable. Any other questions? Lupin asked. The room was quiet except for the persistent rattling of the wardrobe. Very well. Professor Lupin straightened, his wand held loosely in his hand. I want you all to remember something as we do this. The Boggart shows us fear, yes, but by standing here today, by forming this line, by preparing to face it, you've already shown something more powerful than fear. You've shown courage. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite it. He looked at each student in turn, and when his eyes met Morgan's, there was such kindness there that Morgan felt something shift inside. Not the disappearance of fear, but perhaps the first stirrings of something that might stand beside it. Everyone ready? Lupin asked. No one would ever truly be ready, Morgan thought, but they nodded anyway, along with the others. Then let's begin, Professor Lupin said softly, and with a deliberate movement, he fully opened the wardrobe door. The shapeless thing inside seemed to pause, as if sensing the room full of potential fears before it. Then it began to move forward, sliding into the light, preparing to become whatever waited first in line. Ernie Macmillan stepped forward, wand raised, and the Boggart finally took form. The Boggart rippled like water disturbed by a stone, and suddenly Ernie Macmillan was staring at himself, or rather, a version of himself. This Ernie stood with slumped shoulders and hollow eyes, wearing robes that hung loose and shapeless. Most disturbing was the badge pinned crookedly to the chest, a large scarlet T for troll. In the Boggart Ernie's hands were rolls of parchment marked with failing grades, and its mouth moved soundlessly, forming words that seemed to be, I'm not good enough. The real Ernie stood frozen for a moment, face pale. Morgan could see his throat work as he swallowed hard. Then, with visible effort, Ernie raised his wand. Ridiculous! The wand movement was sharp, perhaps too sharp, but the intent was clear. The Boggart, Ernie's robes, suddenly transformed into a jester's costume, complete with bells and a floppy three-pointed hat. The failing grades became joke certificates. Award for Most Dramatic Overreaction, and Certificate of Unnecessary Worry. The badge changed from a T to a sparkling E for exceeds expectations, but it was comically oversized now, nearly as big as the Boggart's head. A startled laugh burst from someone in the line, then another. Ernie's lips twitched, and then he was laughing too, though the sound was slightly shaky. "Excellent, Mr. Macmillan," Professor Lupin called out. "Step back now. Join your classmates." Ernie moved back, still breathing hard, and the Boggart immediately shifted its attention. Padma Patil was next, and the transformation was swift. The jester Ernie melted away, replaced by something that made Padma gasp, an enormous snake, easily 15 feet long, with fangs bared and eyes that glowed an unnatural red. Morgan felt their own breath catch. The snake looked terribly real, scales gleaming in the candlelight, forked tongue flickering out to taste the air. It was nothing like the friendly boa constrictor they'd observed in Care of Magical Creatures. This was something ancient and malevolent. But Padma was already moving, her wand cutting through the air with precision. "Ridiculous!" The snake suddenly sprouted dozens of tiny legs along its body, like a centipede, and instead of slithering, it began to run in place, legs moving in comically uncoordinated fashion. Its hiss became a high-pitched squeak, and its fearsome fangs turned into rubber joke teeth that bounced as it moved. Laughter rippled through the watching students. Padma stepped back, her hand over her mouth, giggling despite herself. The pattern established itself. Student after student stepped forward, each facing a private terror made public. For Lisa Turpin, it was drowning, water filling an invisible room, rising inexorably over her head. Ridiculous! And the water became a cascade of colorful bouncing balls, tumbling harmlessly around her. For Anthony Goldstein, it was his parents arguing, their faces twisted with anger. Ridiculous! And they suddenly wore clown noses and oversized shoes, their angry gestures turning into an elaborate pantomime routine. For Hannah Abbott, standing just ahead of Morgan in line, it was a howling werewolf, all teeth and slavering jaws. Morgan felt Hannah tense, heard her sharp intake of breath. But then, with admirable steadiness, Hannah's wand rose. Ridiculous! The werewolf transformed mid-snarl into a fluffy rabbit with enormous floppy ears, still attempting to look fierce, but succeeding only in looking adorable. It hopped in a circle, clearly confused about its own appearance. Hannah's laugh was more relief than humor, but it was genuine. She practically stumbled back to the group, and Susan squeezed her hand quickly in support. Morgan watched it all with a strange sense of detachment. Part of their mind catalogued each fear, noting patterns, failure, danger, loss, embarrassment, the common threads of human worry rendered visible. Another part of their mind spiraled inward, still searching for what form their own fear would take. The line moved steadily forward. Each successful transformation seemed to build collective confidence. The laughter came more easily now, more genuine. Even Professor Lupin was smiling, occasionally offering quiet words of encouragement or a gentle correction to one technique. Wayne Hopkins faced a giant mountain troll, which became a troll wearing a baby's bonnet and sucking on a massive pacifier. Megan Jones faced her grandmother's portrait, announcing her disownment, which transformed into the portrait singing an off-key operatic version of the announcement while juggling teacups. Justin Finch-Fletchley faced a Dementor, and Morgan saw Professor Lupin tense slightly at that one. but Justin managed to turn it into something wearing a Hawaiian shirt and sunglasses, holding a tiny umbrella drink. "Very good, Mr. Finch-Fletchley," Lupin said, though his voice carried a note of something deeper. "Though we'll be covering actual Dementor defense later this year. They're rather more complicated than Boggart's." The line was getting shorter. Morgan could feel the space closing, the distance between themselves and the wardrobe shrinking with each successful casting. Their palms were slick with sweat. The wand in their hand felt foreign, too light or too heavy. It was hard to tell which. Susan Bones stepped forward. The Boggart, which had been a singing Dementor, rippled and reformed into a figure in official-looking robes bearing the insignia of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The figure's face was stern, disappointed. It held up a wanted poster, but instead of a criminal, it showed Susan's own face beneath the words "traitor to magical Britain." Susan's breath hitched audibly. Morgan could see her wand hand trembling. For a terrible moment, it seemed she might freeze entirely, might fail to cast at all. "You can do this, Susan," Professor Lupin said quietly. "Breathe and focus." Susan's chest rose and fell deliberately. Once, twice. Then her wand rose. "Ridiculous." The stern official suddenly transformed into someone wearing a ridiculous fake mustache that kept falling off. And the wanted poster changed to read, "Wanted for excessive excellence in friendship," with a comically exaggerated drawing that looked nothing like Susan. The official tried to look stern, but kept having to stop to reattach the mustache. The class erupted in supportive laughter. Susan stumbled back, looking shaken but triumphant. Hannah caught her arm, steadying her. 3 people ahead of Morgan now. A Ravenclaw girl faced a failing grade on her Transfiguration OWL, which became a grade written in rainbow colors with little dancing stars around it. A Hufflepuff boy faced his father's angry face, which became his father wearing an enormous fake smile that was so exaggerated it looked like a mask. Each transformation brought laughter, brought relief, brought the sense of fear being conquered. 2 people ahead. Morgan's heart was hammering so hard it seemed impossible that everyone couldn't hear it. Their mouth was dry. The wand in their hand felt like it might slip from their grip at any moment. They tried to rehearse what Professor Lupin had said. Breathe, focus, imagine something silly. But their thoughts were scattered leaves in a hurricane. 1 person ahead. Eleanor Branstone stepped forward, and the Boggart became a massive spider, all hairy legs and clicking mandibles. Eleanor's scream was genuine, but her wand was already moving. Ridiculous! The spider suddenly wore roller skates on all 8 legs and immediately lost its balance, tumbling over itself in a tangle of confused limbs. The clicking became a sound like a bicycle bell. Eleanor backed away quickly, laughing breathlessly. And then there was no one between Morgan and the wardrobe. The Boggart spider melted away, sensing a new fear to feed upon. Morgan stepped forward on legs that felt disconnected from their body. The cleared space in the center of the classroom suddenly felt enormous, like standing on a stage before a vast audience. They could feel every eye on them. 20 classmates, Professor Lupin. Even the portraits on the walls seemed to lean in with interest. The Boggart was shapeless for a moment, a dark mass that writhed and twisted. Morgan tried to ready their wand, tried to remember the movement and the words, but their mind had gone terribly, perfectly blank. Then the Boggart found its form. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a spider or a snake or a werewolf. It wasn't even something obviously frightening, like a dementor or a disappointed authority figure. It was Morgan. Or rather, it was Morgan standing alone in the Hogwarts corridor. The Boggart Morgan looked small somehow, despite being the same size as the real Morgan. It stood in a hallway that stretched endlessly in both directions, doors lining the walls, but all of them closed. The Boggart Morgan was calling out. Morgan could see the mouth moving, see the desperate gestures, but no sound came. No one answered. No one appeared. The Boggart Morgan began trying doors, pulling at handles that wouldn't open, pounding on wood that didn't respond. The movements became more frantic, more desperate. Still, no one came. The corridor remained empty except for this one small figure, alone, unheard, unable to reach anyone. Then the Boggart Morgan turned to face the real Morgan directly, and his face was twisted with a terrible knowledge that no one was coming, that no one would notice the absence, that loneliness wasn't just a temporary state, but a permanent condition. Morgan's wand hand dropped slightly. Their throat had closed up entirely. This wasn't like the other fears. There was no obvious monster to make ridiculous, no clear enemy to transform. How did you make loneliness funny? How did you laugh at isolation? Morgan. Professor Lupin's voice cut through the spiral of panic, not loud, but firm. Breathe. You can do this. But Morgan couldn't move, couldn't think. The Boggart Morgan in the empty corridor was reaching out now, silently pleading, and it was too real, too close to fears that lived in the hollow spaces of Morgan's chest during sleepless nights. "Look at it, Morgan," Lupin said. And there was something in his voice, understanding, perhaps. The sound of someone who had faced his own version of this fear. "Really look. What's the silliest thing that could happen in that corridor?" Morgan forced themselves to focus. The empty corridor, the closed doors, the reaching, pleading figure. What would make this absurd? What could possibly... And then, almost without thinking, almost as a desperate grasp at anything, Morgan raised their wand. "Ridiculous," they whispered. It was barely audible, barely more than breath, but their wand moved in the upward arc they'd practiced. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The Boggart Morgan continued its silent pleading in the empty corridor. Morgan felt their chest constrict with failure, with the certainty that they couldn't even manage this simple charm, that even here they were alone in their inability to. Then the corridor doors burst open, all of them, simultaneously, with comical force, and from each door poured people, but not normal people. They were absurdly costumed, wearing everything from ball gowns to suits of armor to pajamas covered in dancing hippogriffs. They rushed toward the Boggart Morgan, not with the horror of crowd overwhelming one person, but with the exaggerated enthusiasm of party guests greeting a beloved friend. The Boggart Morgan was suddenly surrounded, but instead of being threatening, it was ridiculous. The costumed figures began dancing around the Boggart Morgan in a conga line, some playing invisible instruments, others tossing confetti that appeared from nowhere. One wore a banner reading, "You're never alone, even when you want to be," in glittering letters. The transformation was so absurd, so utterly unexpected, that someone in the class snorted with laughter. Then another person laughed, then several more. Morgan felt their own lips twitch. The tightness in their chest didn't disappear entirely, but it loosened. Because it was ridiculous. The idea of being so emphatically not alone that people in silly costumes threw impromptu parties in empty corridors. It was the opposite extreme of the fear, rendered in such exaggerated form that it became impossible to take seriously. "Excellent, Morgan." Professor Lupin's voice was warm with approval. "Step back now." Morgan stumbled backward, legs shaking. Hannah caught their elbow, steadying them, and Morgan found themselves back in the line of students, their hearts still racing, but something essential accomplished. "Well done," Susan whispered on their other side. "Really creative," Ernie added, sounding genuinely impressed. Morgan barely heard them. They were too busy trying to process what had just happened. The fear made manifest, the transformation, the laughter that had risen unbidden from their own throat, even as their hands still trembled. The Boggart shifted its attention to the next student in line, the conga dancing figures melting away to become a new fear for someone else to face. Morgan watched with detached fascination as a Ravenclaw girl confronted a failing report card that became a report card giving her top marks in underwater basket weaving and advanced nap-taking. The rest of the lesson passed in a blur. More students faced their fears. More transformations brought laughter. Professor Lupin moved through it all like a conductor guiding an orchestra, offering encouragement, providing assistance when needed, his wand always ready but rarely required. Finally, after what felt like both forever and no time at all, the last student completed their turn. The Boggart, thoroughly confused and weakened by so much laughter, had lost much of its previous menace. It flickered uncertainly between forms, unable to settle on any single fear. Professor Lupin stepped forward. "Well done, all of you," he said, and with a casual flick of his wand and a muttered spell, the Boggart dissolved into a wisp of smoke and vanished back into the wardrobe. He closed the door firmly and locked it with a tap of his wand. The classroom erupted in chatter, excited, relieved, triumphant. Students compared their experiences, laughed at their fears in retrospect, marveled at the transformations others had created. The nervous tension that had filled the room at the lesson's start had been entirely replaced by a buzzing energy. Morgan stood quietly in the midst of it, still processing. Their hands had finally stopped shaking. Their heart rate was returning to normal. But something inside felt different, not transformed exactly, but shifted, like a weight had been acknowledged, examined, and found to be less immovable than previously believed. Settle down," Professor Lupin called, though he was smiling broadly. "Before you go, I want you to write a short essay, just 1 foot of parchment, on what you learned today. Not about Boggarts necessarily, though you can include that. I want you to reflect on the experience of facing your fear. What surprised you? What did you learn about yourself? Due next class." The groans at the mention of homework were half-hearted at best. Most students were still too energized from the lesson to care much about an essay. "Off you go then," Lupin said. "An excellent work today. Truly exceptional. You should all be very proud." The class began to file out, conversations continuing into the corridor. Morgan moved with the flow, Hannah and Susan on either side. "That was incredible," Susan was saying. "Terrifying, but incredible." "Your transformation was brilliant, Morgan," Hannah added. "The conga line. Where did that even come from?" "I don't know," Morgan admitted. "It just appeared in my head." They glanced back as they reached the doorway. Professor Lupin was returning his desk to its proper position, the wardrobe now innocuous-looking in the corner. As if sensing Morgan's gaze, he looked up and offered a small, knowing smile. Morgan smiled back, tentative but real, and followed their friends into the corridor. The lesson was over. The Boggart had been faced. And somehow, impossibly, Morgan had laughed at their deepest fear. It didn't make the fear go away entirely, but it made it feel, for the first time, like something that could be managed, something that didn't have to rule in the darkness. That, Morgan was beginning to realize, might be the real magic of the ridiculous charm. The afternoon light, filtering through the castle windows, had taken on the golden quality of approaching evening by the time Morgan found themselves alone in the library. Not entirely alone, of course. Madame Pince prowled the stacks with her usual vigilance, and a handful of older students occupied tables near the restricted section, bent over thick volumes with the desperate intensity of those facing NEWTS. But Morgan had claimed a small table tucked between shelves of transfiguration theory and outdated herbology texts, a quiet corner where the world felt pleasantly distant. The essay for Professor Lupin lay before them, parchment still mostly blank, save for the heading. Reflection on Facing the Boggart stared back accusingly. Morgan's quill hovered over the page, depositing small ink blots that would need to be vanished later. What had they learned? The question felt too large, too complicated to fit into 12 inches of parchment. They'd learned that fear had a shape, for one thing, that it could be summoned and contained and transformed. They'd learned that 20 students could face 20 different terrors in the same room and somehow make it through to the other side. They'd learned that Professor Lupin understood things about fear that went deeper than textbook definitions. But there were other things too, harder things. Things that had followed Morgan from the defense classroom, like shadows that grew longer as the day progressed. The Boggart had shown them something true. That was the uncomfortable part. It hadn't conjured some abstract monster or unlikely scenario. It had reached into Morgan's chest and pulled out the fear that lived there in the quiet hours. The fear of being fundamentally alone despite being surrounded by people. Morgan set down their quill and leaned back, closing their eyes. The memory of the lesson returned with uncomfortable clarity. Standing in that cleared space, every eye on them, the moment of shapelessness before the Boggart found its form, then seeing themselves, small, desperate, trying door after door in an endless corridor where no one answered. The silence had been the worst part. Not screaming silence, not the dramatic quiet of horror stories, but the ordinary absence of response, the kind of silence that suggested no one had even noticed there was someone worth responding to. Bit dramatic for a Tuesday afternoon, isn't it? Morgan's eyes snapped open. A girl stood beside their table, 6th or 7th year by the look of her robes, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and shrewd eyes that suggested she missed very little. "Sorry," Morgan managed. "The existential crisis," the girl said matter-of-factly, gesturing at the blank parchment and Morgan's slumped posture. "You've got the look. Had defense with Lupin today, did you?" "Boggart?" Morgan nodded, not trusting their voice. The girl pulled out the chair across from Morgan without asking permission and sat down. "Thought so. I had him last year. Brilliant teacher, though his lessons have a way of following you home." She offered a hand across the table. Penelope Clearwater, Ravenclaw. Morgan Fletcher, Hufflepuff. The handshake was brief but firm. Right then, Morgan Fletcher of Hufflepuff. What did your Boggart show you? The question was so direct, so casually invasive, that Morgan almost laughed. That's kind of personal, isn't it? Terribly personal, Penelope agreed cheerfully. Which is why it's sometimes easier to talk to a stranger about it than to your friends. They know you too well. You can see them trying to figure out what your fear means, how it connects to things you've said or done. A stranger has no context. I'm just curiosity and decent advice. Morgan studied her for a moment. There was something refreshing about her directness, the way she'd simply announced her intentions rather than dancing around them. Why do you care? Because I sat exactly where you're sitting last year, staring at the same blank essay, trying to figure out how to write about facing a boggart, without actually writing about it. Penelope leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. Mine showed me Percy Weasley telling me I wasn't good enough to be prefect, which was mortifying, given that Percy is my boyfriend and was standing right there in the class. Despite everything, Morgan felt their lips twitch. That must have been awkward. Spectacularly awkward, though it led to a useful conversation about academic pressure and self-worth. So silver linings and all that. Penelope's expression softened slightly. Point is, boggarts are cruel in their honesty. They don't show you your silliest fear or your most dramatic one. They show you the fear you're actually living with, day to day. The one that shapes decisions you don't even realize you're making. Morgan looked down at their hands, fingers twisted together on the table. It showed me alone, they said quietly, in a corridor at Hogwarts, trying to get anyone to notice, to respond. No one came, no one answered, just silence. The words hung in the air between them. Saying it aloud somehow made it more real, more shameful. What kind of person, surrounded by hundreds of students and teachers, feared loneliness? It seemed greedy, ungrateful even. Ah, Penelope said, and there was understanding in the single syllable. The invisible fear. One of the harder ones, that. Is it? Morgan looked up, surprised. Of course. Much easier to be afraid of something external. Spiders, heights, failing marks. Those are fears you can address directly. Do the work. Avoid the spider. Stay on the ground. But being afraid of loneliness while surrounded by people? That's complicated. Because the people are right there, and you're still afraid. Which means the fear isn't really about whether people are present. It's about whether you're truly connected to them. Morgan felt something in their chest tighten. That was exactly it. The fear wasn't about being physically alone. It was about being alone in the ways that mattered. About wondering if the friendships they had were real or just proximity and politeness. About lying awake at night wondering if anyone would actually notice if they disappeared, or if people would just shift slightly and fill the space where they'd been. How do you stop being afraid of that? Morgan asked, and hated how young their voice sounded. Penelope was quiet for a moment, considering. You don't, really. Or rather, you don't stop being afraid so much as you learn to act despite the fear. You reach out even when you're terrified of being rejected or ignored. You trust that the friendships you have are real, even when your brain insists they're not. You choose connection over self-protection. That sounds exhausting. It absolutely is, Penelope agreed, but so is the alternative. Isolating yourself because you're afraid of being isolated anyway. That's just doing the Boggart's work for it, isn't it? Morgan thought about Hannah and Susan, the way they'd steadied them after the Boggart, the genuine warmth in their voices. Thought about Ernie's impressed comment about the transformation Morgan had created, about Professor Lupin's understanding smile. Small moments, easy to dismiss as politeness or obligation. But what if they weren't? What if they were real, and it was fear that insisted on questioning them? The essay, Penelope said, tapping the blank parchment. Don't try to solve the fear in 12 inches. Lupin doesn't expect that. Just write what you learned about the mechanics of fear, how it felt, what surprised you, what you noticed. Save the existential crisis for your journal. I don't keep a journal. Then save it for long walks around the lake and conversations with friends who care about you. Penelope stood, shouldering her bag. And speaking of caring, your housemates, the blonde and the redhead. They've walked past this corner 3 times in the last 10 minutes, pretending to be looking for books but actually checking on you. Morgan turned quickly, but the aisle behind them was empty now. I didn't see them. That's because they're being subtle about it. Well, trying to be subtle. The redhead isn't particularly good at it. Penelope smiled. That's connection, Fletcher. They finished dinner, realized you weren't there, and came looking. They're probably worried you're upset about the lesson. You could let them find you. Let them help. Or I could finish this essay alone. You could, Penelope agreed. But I think we both know which choice the Boggart would prefer you make. She walked away before Morgan could respond, disappearing into the stacks with the casual confidence of someone who'd said exactly what they'd come to say. Morgan sat alone, or not quite alone, given Madame Pince's continued vigilance and the other students scattered throughout the library, and looked down at the still blank parchment. The ink blots had multiplied during the conversation. They'd need to start fresh on a new sheet. Footsteps approached, trying for quiet and not quite achieving it. Morgan didn't turn around. We're not very good at subtle, are we? Hannah's voice came from behind. Terrible at it, Susan agreed. And then they were both there, sliding into chairs on either side of Morgan's table without asking permission. Just like Penelope had done, but somehow entirely different. Sorry, Hannah said. We were trying to give you space, but then we started worrying that giving you space meant leaving you alone. And after today's lesson that seemed potentially the opposite of helpful, Susan finished. So we compromised by lurking creepily in the library. Morgan felt something in their chest loosen, laughter, or perhaps relief, or maybe both tangled together. I noticed. Well, someone noticed and told me. The Ravenclaw girl, Susan asked. She looked wise. Was she wise? Annoyingly wise, Morgan admitted. She said I should let you find me. We already found you, Hannah pointed out. You're right here. We're excellent finders. She meant emotionally, probably. Let you help instead of pushing you away. The 3 of them sat in silence for a moment. The library sounds continued around them. The scratch of quills, the rustle of turning pages, Madame Pince's sharp whisper telling someone to stop leaning on an ancient tome. The Boggart showed you something hard, didn't it? Susan said finally. Her voice was gentle, careful. You seemed shaken afterward, more than the rest of us. Morgan looked at their blank parchment, at their two friends sitting on either side, at the way they'd sought them out despite Morgan's withdrawal. The fears said this wasn't real, that they were just being kind out of obligation. But Penelope's words echoed, choose connection over self-protection. It showed me alone, Morgan said, in a Hogwarts corridor, trying to get anyone to notice, and no one coming, just being invisible. Hannah made a small sound, something between sympathy and distress. That's rubbish, Susan said flatly. You're not invisible. We'd notice immediately if you weren't there. Would you, though? The question came out before Morgan could stop it. Or would you just adjust? Find someone else to sit with, to study with. Life goes on. That's not how friendship works, Hannah said. And there was unusual firmness in her voice. Hannah, who was always gentle, always accommodating, sounded almost offended. You're not just filling a seat, Morgan. You're our friend. A real friend. The kind we'd miss. How do you know? Morgan asked, and hated the vulnerability in the question, but couldn't seem to stop. How do you know any friendship is real and not just habit? Susan and Hannah exchanged a look over Morgan's head. One of those silent conversations that close friends could have in a glance. Remember second week of term last year? Susan asked. When I got that howler from my aunt about my mum's work at the ministry. I was so embarrassed I hid in the bathroom for 2 hours. Morgan nodded. They remembered Susan's face flaming red at breakfast, the cruel laughter from some of the other houses, her sudden disappearance. You found me, Susan continued. Not immediately, which I appreciated, because I needed some time to cry. But after about 2 hours, you came looking. You brought chocolate frogs and sat outside the bathroom stall and told me terrible jokes until I laughed. You didn't try to fix it or tell me it wasn't that bad. You just stayed. That's just being decent, Morgan protested. No, Hannah said. Decent is asking if someone's okay and accepting I'm fine as an answer. What you did was friendship. Caring enough to look, to stay, to help even when it was awkward. And remember when my gran was ill last winter, Hannah added. Everyone said I'm sorry and hope she gets better, which was kind. But you asked me how I was feeling about it every few days. Not in a nosy way, just checking in, making sure I wasn't carrying it alone. Do you know how much that meant? Morgan hadn't really thought about either incident. They'd just done what felt right, what they'd want someone to do for them. Those are small things. Friendship is small things, Susan said. It's not grand gestures and dramatic declarations. It's showing up, paying attention, caring consistently. And you do that, Morgan, for us and for others. So when you ask how we'd know the friendship is real, that's how. Because we've seen you be a real friend, which means we know what that looks like, and we can recognize when we're receiving it back. Morgan felt something shifting inside. Not the disappearance of fear, but perhaps the first acknowledgement that fear might be wrong, might be a liar dressed in the costume of protection. The Boggart, Hannah said quietly. It doesn't show you truth, you know. It shows you fear, and fear is often a terrible narrator. It exaggerates, catastrophizes, lies. Professor Lupin mentioned that once, Susan added. Last year, when someone's Boggart showed them friendless and alone, he said Boggarts are masters of worst-case scenarios, not actual prophecies. Morgan picked up their quill, looked at the blank parchment, and finally, began to write. Today, I learned that fear has a shape and a voice, and that both can be challenged. I learned that what frightens me most isn't monsters or danger, but isolation, the possibility of being unseen despite being surrounded by people. I learned that the ridiculous charm works not by denying the fear, but by refusing to let it have the final word. And I learned that sometimes the most powerful magic isn't in the spell we cast, but in allowing others to stand beside us while we cast it. The quill moved steadily across the parchment now, words flowing more easily. Hannah and Susan had pulled out their own essays, working in comfortable silence, occasionally sharing a reference from their textbook or comparing notes on Boggart behavior. Morgan glanced up at them, really looked. Susan's tongue poked out slightly when she concentrated, a habit she probably didn't know she had. Hannah hummed under her breath, something soft and tuneless that Morgan had heard 100 times before in the dormitory. Small details, the kind you only noticed about people you spent real time with, people you actually saw. The kind of details that suggested the fear might be wrong about invisibility after all. Morgan returned to their essay, and for the first time since the defense against the dark arts lesson, the weight in their chest felt bearable, not gone. Penelope had been right, that you didn't simply stop being afraid, but manageable, possible to carry without it crushing everything else. Outside the library windows, the sun continued its descent toward the horizon. Somewhere in the castle, other students moved through their evening routines. Dinner in the great hall, homework in common rooms, Quidditch practice on the grounds. Hogwarts continued its ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of individual students. But here, in this quiet corner of the library, 3 Hufflepuffs worked on essays about facing fears, and if one of them wrote with slightly less terror than they'd felt a few hours ago, if one of them was beginning to understand that being afraid and being alone were not the same thing, well, that was its own kind of magic, the kind that didn't require a wand at all. The next defense against the dark arts lesson arrived with the particular weight of unfinished business. Morgan had spent the intervening days in a strange state of suspension, not quite dreading the return to Professor Lupin's classroom, but not exactly eager for it either. The essay had been turned in, carefully written on fresh parchment with no ink blots. The words had felt true when Morgan wrote them, but truth had a way of feeling less certain in the cold light of morning. Hannah and Susan had been carefully casual about the upcoming lesson, not avoiding mention of it entirely. That would have been too obvious, but not dwelling on it either. They'd found a comfortable middle ground of normalcy that Morgan appreciated more than they could articulate. Now, walking through the corridors toward the defense classroom, Morgan felt the familiar tightness returning to their chest. Not as severe as before, perhaps, but present nonetheless. Lupin said we'd be continuing Boggart defense this week, Susan mentioned as they climbed the stairs to the first floor, building on what we learned. More Boggarts? Morgan asked, trying to keep their voice neutral. I don't think so. He mentioned something about theoretical applications, understanding the principle behind the charm so we could apply it to other defensive magic. Hannah adjusted her bag on her shoulder. Should be less terrifying than last time at least. The classroom was already half full when they arrived. Students clustered in small groups, conversations buzzing with the particular energy of those who'd shared a memorable experience. Morgan caught fragments as they found seats near the middle of the room. Still can't believe mine turned into... My brother said his year did something different. Apparently, Lupin changes the lessons. Wonder if we'll actually have to face it again. The wardrobe stood in its corner, silent and innocuous. Locked, Morgan remembered. Professor Lupin had secured it at the end of last lesson. Still, Morgan found their eyes drawn to it repeatedly, as if expecting it to rattle or burst open at any moment. Professor Lupin entered precisely as the bells finished chiming the hour. He looked tired today. There were shadows under his eyes that spoke of poor sleep or illness. But his smile was genuine as he surveyed the class. "Good afternoon," he said, moving to stand before his desk rather than behind it. "I've read your essays, and I must say I'm impressed by the thoughtfulness of your reflections. You've all demonstrated not just magical competence, but genuine insight into the nature of fear and courage." He pulled out his wand, and with a casual flick, names began appearing in golden script in the air, students whose essays had particularly stood out. Morgan was surprised to see their own name among them, floating near the top of the list alongside Ernie's, Padma's, and several others. "These students showed exceptional understanding," Lupin continued, "but truly, all of you should be proud of last lesson's work. Facing a Boggart for the first time is never easy, and you all handled it with admirable courage." The names faded, and Lupin began to pace slowly, not nervous energy, but the movement of a teacher gathering his thoughts. "Today, we're going to do something different. We're not going to face the Boggart again." I can feel the collective relief in the room. "Don't worry," a few nervous laughs. "Instead, I want to examine what happened during that lesson. What actually occurred, mechanically and magically, when you cast the ridiculous charm." He stopped pacing, turned to face them fully. "Can anyone tell me what the primary component of the charm is? Not the wand movement or the incantation, but the real magic at the heart of it." Several hands rose. Lupin nodded to Anthony Goldstein. "The transformation, sir? Changing the fear into something funny?" "Close, but not quite. The transformation is the result, not the component." Lupin pointed to Ernie next. "The imagination, Professor. Visualizing what you want the Boggart to become." "Closer. Yes, imagination is crucial, but there's something deeper. Miss Abbott." Hannah spoke carefully, thinking through her words. "Is it willpower? The determination to change the fear?" Warmer still. Lupin smiled. "Mr. Fletcher, you wrote something interesting in your essay about the spell. Would you care to share?" Morgan's stomach dropped. They'd written quite a bit in that essay. Too much, probably, about fear and connection and the various ways terror could manifest. Which part had caught Professor Lupin's attention? I'm not sure which part you mean, sir. You wrote, and I'm paraphrasing, that the charm works by refusing to let fear have the final word. That it's not about denying fear exists, but about insisting that fear isn't the only thing that exists. Lupin's eyes were keen, gentle. Would you elaborate on that? Every eye in the classroom turned to Morgan. The attention felt heavy, uncomfortable, but there was genuine curiosity in the gazes, not mockery. And Professor Lupin's expression held only encouragement. Morgan took a breath. "I just meant that. When the Boggart showed me what I was afraid of, it felt completely real, complete, like that fear was the whole truth of everything. But then, when I cast the charm, when I made it change, I wasn't saying the fear was fake. I was saying it wasn't the only possible truth. That there could be something else too. Something lighter. The words came out awkwardly, not as eloquent as they'd seemed in written form, but Professor Lupin was nodding slowly, a smile spreading across his tired face. Exactly, he said softly. Exactly that. 5 points to Hufflepuff for exceptional insight. He turned to address the whole class. The heart of the ridiculous charm, the real magic of it, is perspective. The ability to look at something that terrifies you and choose to see it differently. Not to deny the fear, but to refuse to let fear be the only lens through which you view reality. Lupin pulled out his wand again, and a diagram began forming in the air. More complex than the simple fear, arrow, laughter, arrow, weakness from last lesson. This one showed multiple pathways, branches, possibilities. Fear narrows perspective, Lupin said, pointing to the diagram's center. It's a survival mechanism, actually quite useful when you're facing genuine danger. Fear focuses your attention, speeds your reactions, prepares your body to flee or fight. But fear also lies. It tells you that the worst possible outcome is the only outcome, that catastrophe is inevitable, that you're powerless. The diagram shifted, showing how fear narrowed into a single point, a tunnel with no exits. The ridiculous charm, and really any effective defense against fear-based magic, works by expanding perspective again, by acknowledging fear's voice but refusing to accept it as the only authority. You add other possibilities, other truths, the ability to imagine something different. Morgan watched the diagram branch outward, showing multiple paths emerging from that narrow point of fear. It was mesmerizing, watching the visual representation of what they'd felt during the lesson. This principle, Lupin continued, extends far beyond Boggart's. When we covered Dementors later this year, several students shifted uneasily at the word. You'll find that the Patronus charm operates on a similar foundation. Dementors feed on despair, on the certainty that happiness is impossible. The Patronus requires you to hold on to a moment of genuine joy, to insist that joy is just as real as despair, even when despair feels overwhelming. He waved his wand, and the diagram dissolved into mist. Today, I want you to practice that mental transformation without actually facing a Boggart. We're going to work on the skill of perspective shifting itself. A collective relaxation rippled through the room. No Boggarts meant no public confrontation of private terrors. Even students who'd handled the previous lesson well looked relieved. I'm going to give you a common fear, something simple and non-personal, Lupin said. Your task is to practice looking at it from multiple angles, finding not just one ridiculous transformation, but several, training your mind to be flexible, to automatically seek alternatives rather than fixating on the fear itself. He conjured an image in the air, a large menacing spider, similar to the ones several students had faced last lesson. It wasn't real, just a magical projection, but it was detailed enough to make several people flinch. Let's start with this. A spider. For those of you afraid of spiders, this represents genuine fear. For those of you not bothered by them, use your imagination. How could we transform this to make it ridiculous? Put it in a tutu, someone called out immediately. The suggestion seemed to have become a class favorite. Give it a squeaky voice. Make it tiny. Give it roller skates. That one got a laugh, given Eleanor's successful transformation last lesson. Excellent start. Lupin said approvingly. The projected spider began cycling through the suggested transformations. Tutu, roller skates, shrinking to the size of a freckle, speaking in a high-pitched squeak. Each iteration brought laughter. But let's go deeper. What else? What if we transform the context rather than the spider itself? The class went quiet, thinking. Then Padma raised her hand. Make it afraid of us? Like it's running away, screaming? Wonderful. More. Put it in a silly situation, Susan offered, like trying to use a tiny spider-sized umbrella in the rain. Have it doing something helpful, Morgan heard themselves saying. Like knitting a sweater with its web. The suggestions came faster now, students building on each other's ideas. The spider projection transformed repeatedly, becoming a dance instructor, a tiny chef with a tinier chef's hat, a student struggling with homework, a professional wearing business robes and carrying a briefcase. Each transformation revealed a different approach to the same fear. Lupin was beaming. Do you see what's happening? You're not just finding one way to defang the fear. You're training yourselves to see that there are dozens of ways. Hundreds, potentially. The fear wants you to believe there's only one truth. This is terrifying, and you are helpless. But you're proving that there are infinite other truths available if you're willing to look for them. He dismissed the spider projection with a wave. Now, pair up. I'm going to give each pair a different common fear. Your task is to spend the next 15 minutes finding as many ridiculous transformations as possible. Don't just go for the obvious ones. Challenge yourselves. Find the weird, the unexpected, the transformations that make you actually laugh rather than just smile politely. The classroom erupted into movement and noise as students found partners. Hannah and Susan immediately turned to Morgan, but there were 3 of them, and pairs needed only 2. I can work with Ernie, Morgan offered, seeing him looking around for a partner. Are you sure? Susan asked quietly. We could do a trio. I'm sure, Morgan said, and was surprised to find they meant it. The prospect of working with Ernie, confident, knowledgeable Ernie, didn't feel as daunting as it might have a week ago. Morgan joined Ernie at a desk near the window. Professor Lupin approached with a small card, which he placed face down between them. Your fear, he said with a slight smile. Work together. Remember, you're looking for quantity and creativity. Don't censor yourselves. He moved on to the next pair, and Ernie flipped the card. Fear, public speaking. Being judged by a crowd, Ernie let out a short laugh. Oh, this one's personal for both of us, I reckon. I talk a lot, but I'm always worried I'm boring everyone or saying something stupid. Morgan looked at him, surprised. Ernie always seemed so confident, so certain of his opinions and knowledge. Really? Really? Why do you think I over-explain everything? If I give enough information, maybe people won't notice if some of it's wrong. Ernie pulled out parchment and quill. Right, transformations. Let's start obvious and work our way to creative. They began brainstorming, quills scratching notes as ideas flowed. Audience falls asleep and starts snoring in chorus. Crowd is actually cardboard cutouts. Everyone's wearing ridiculous hats that distract from the speaker. The podium is bouncy, making serious speaking impossible. The transformations came easily at first, the low-hanging fruit of comedy. But then they had to dig deeper, think harder. And something interesting happened. Working through the fear analytically as a puzzle to be solved made it feel less personal, less crushing. What if the fear of judgment got turned around? Morgan suggested. Like you start speaking and the audience immediately starts giving you a standing ovation before you've said anything. Or they're all so busy judging each other, they don't notice you at all. Ernie added, warming to the theme. Everyone's holding up scorecards, but rating the person next to them instead. The whole audience is made up of supportive grandmothers who think everything you say is brilliant. They're all wearing mirrors for faces, so you can only see yourself reflected back, taking away the actual judging gazes. They worked in comfortable focus, the list growing longer. Around them, other pairs engaged in similar work. The classroom filled with laughter and animated discussion as fears were dissected, examined, and systematically stripped of their power through creative absurdity. Professor Lupin moved through the room, pausing at each pair to listen, encourage, occasionally suggest a direction they hadn't considered. When he reached Morgan and Ernie, he spent several moments reading their list, nodding with approval. Excellent work, both of you. I particularly like this one. He pointed to Morgan's suggestion about the mirrors. That shows real insight into what makes the fear powerful in the first place. It's not really about the crowd, is it? It's about what we imagine the crowd is thinking. Exactly, Ernie said. Most of the time, people aren't judging us nearly as harshly as we judge ourselves. A lesson that takes some people a lifetime to learn, Lupin said quietly. You two are ahead of the curve. He glanced at Morgan meaningfully before moving on to the next pair. Morgan and Ernie continued working, but something had shifted. The fear on the card, public speaking, judgment, the weight of others' eyes, felt less like a looming threat and more like a puzzle they were successfully solving. Each transformation they created was proof that the fear could be approached from multiple angles, that it wasn't a monolithic, unmovable truth. You know, Ernie said after a while, not looking up from the parchment, I was really impressed by your Boggart transformation. The conga line, that was brilliant. Creative in a way mine wasn't. Morgan felt the heat rise to their cheeks. Yours was good too. The jester costume was the first thing that came to mind. Not particularly original. Ernie set down his quill, finally meeting Morgan's eyes. I'm good at studying, at memorizing, at understanding theory, but creative magic? That's harder for me. You made it look easy. It didn't feel easy, Morgan admitted. I nearly froze completely. If Professor Lupin hadn't said something, I'm not sure I could have cast at all. But you did. That's what matters. Ernie smiled, genuine, without his usual bravado. And you've given me about 15 new ideas for if I ever face another Boggart. So, thanks for being a good partner. Thanks for not making me feel stupid when I suggested something weird, Morgan replied. They shared a look of understanding. Two students who'd been circling each other with cautious respect, suddenly realizing they might actually be friends. The lesson continued around them, Professor Lupin eventually calling for attention to share some of the best transformations. The classroom erupted in laughter repeatedly as pairs described their most creative solutions. Susan and Hannah had transformed the fear of heights into floating on a giant friendly cloud that gave guided tours. Anthony and Padma had turned fear of failure into a scenario where failing resulted in confetti cannons and celebration. As the lesson drew to a close, Lupin stood before them with obvious satisfaction. What you've done today is practice one of the most valuable skills in defensive magic and in life, frankly. You've trained yourselves to respond to fear not with paralysis or panic, but with creativity, with the absolute refusal to accept that fear's version of reality is the only version. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each student. The next time you face something that frightens you, in this classroom or elsewhere, I want you to remember this feeling, the feeling of looking at fear and finding dozen ways to transform it. That's not just magic, that's power. The bells chimed, signaling the end of class. Students began gathering their things, conversations continuing as they filed toward the door. Morgan walked out with Ernie, Hannah, and Susan, feeling something unfamiliar and precious unfurling in their chest. Not the absence of fear. That persistent companion still lurked in the shadows. Probably always would. But alongside it now was something else. Something that felt remarkably like hope. The corridor stretched ahead, filled with students and noise and the ordinary chaos of Hogwarts between lessons. And Morgan, walking among friends who'd sought them out and worked beside them and genuinely seemed to enjoy their company, felt less invisible than they had in quite some time. The Boggart had shown them isolation. But these lessons, these people, were showing them something different. Maybe both things could be true. Maybe the fear and the connection could coexist. And maybe, just maybe, connection could grow stronger through practice, through choosing it deliberately, through refusing to let fear write the only story. It was, Morgan thought, its own kind of ridiculous charm. And it was working. The Halloween feast was 3 days away, and Hogwarts had transformed accordingly. Live bats swooped through the Great Hall during meals. Pumpkins lined every corridor, and the suits of armor had been enchanted to hum ominous tunes whenever students passed. The castle seemed to lean into its own spookiness, celebrating the one night when darkness could be playful rather than threatening. Even the ghosts were more animated than usual. Nearly headless Nick, practicing his head removal party trick at increasingly inconvenient moments. But for Morgan, the most significant transformation wasn't decorative. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the Boggart lesson, and something fundamental had shifted. Not dramatically. There'd been no single moment of revelation, no lightning bolt of change. Instead, it was like watching ice melt, imperceptible moment to moment, but undeniable over time. Morgan had started accepting more invitations, study sessions in the library, a trip to the owlery with Hannah to send letters home, even a somewhat chaotic game of gobstones in the common room that had ended with Susan covered in foul-smelling liquid after a particularly aggressive stone retaliation. Small things, normal things, the kind of casual socializing that Morgan had previously declined with various excuses about homework or tiredness or just not feeling up to it. The fear hadn't disappeared. Morgan still woke sometimes at 3 a.m. with that familiar weight on their chest, still had moments of wondering if friendships were real or imagined, still caught themselves analyzing interactions for signs of forced politeness versus genuine care. But now, alongside the fear, was the memory of 20 different transformations of public speaking anxiety. The knowledge that fear's narrative wasn't the only one available. Choose connection over self-protection, Penelope Clearwater had said. Morgan was learning what that looked like in practice. Earth to Morgan, Susan's voice cut through their thoughts. You're doing it again. They were in defense against the dark arts, waiting for Professor Lupin to arrive. The classroom hummed with pre-lesson conversation. Students clustered at desks, comparing Transfiguration homework and debating whether the Gryffindor-Slytherin Quidditch match would actually happen given the recent Dementor incident. Doing what? Morgan asked. That thing where you go somewhere else in your head, Hannah explained gently. You get this look like you're working through something complicated. Sorry, just thinking. About, Susan prompted, not unkindly. Morgan considered deflecting, then remembered. Connection over self-protection. About how things feel different lately. Better different. Hannah's face lit up with one of her warm, genuine smiles. They are different. You're different. More present, I suppose. Was I that absent before? Not absent exactly, Susan said carefully. Just cautious. Like you were always waiting for something to go wrong. Lately, you seem more relaxed. Before Morgan could respond, Professor Lupin entered. He looked better today than he had recently. The shadows under his eyes had faded somewhat, and there was energy in his step that had been missing the previous week. Good afternoon, he called, moving to stand before his desk. Today we're going to do something a bit unusual. We're going to laugh. The class exchanged confused glances. Ernie's hand shot up immediately. Yes, Mr. Macmillan. Sir, is that an assignment? To laugh? In a manner of speaking. Lupin's eyes twinkled with something between amusement and anticipation. Over the past 2 weeks, we've worked extensively with Boggarts and fear transformation. You've all demonstrated excellent technical skill with the ridiculous charm. But I've noticed something interesting. When we practice the charm in pairs or discuss it theoretically, your transformations are creative and genuinely funny. But when you actually faced the Boggart, many of you struggled to laugh. The transformation happened, but the laughter felt forced, obligatory rather than genuine. Morgan thought back to their own experience. The conga line had been absurd, yes, and they'd felt their lips twitch with something like humor. But real laughter, the kind that bubbled up unbidden and irresistible, that hadn't come until later in the library with Hannah and Susan. This matters, Lupin continued, because laughter isn't just a response to the ridiculous transformation, it's part of the magic itself. Genuine laughter creates a very specific type of energy. Joy-based magic is some of the most powerful defensive magic that exists. The Patronus charm, which we'll cover later, relies entirely on it. He began pacing, warming to his subject. But here's the problem. You can't force genuine laughter. You can't command yourself to find something funny. Forced laughter, polite laughter, obligatory laughter, these don't carry the same magical resonance as the real thing. So today, we're going to practice accessing genuine joy and genuine laughter, even in moments of stress. Padma Patil raised her hand. How do you practice that, Professor? Either something's funny, or it isn't. Excellent question. 5 points to Ravenclaw. Lupin stopped pacing, turning to face the class fully. You're right that you can't force something to be funny, but you can create conditions where laughter becomes more accessible. You can remind yourself of genuinely funny memories. You can surround yourself with people whose humor you appreciate. You can practice the physical act of laughing until it triggers the genuine emotional response. He pulled out his wand. We're going to start with something simple. I want everyone to stand up. Push your desks to the sides. We need space. There was confused shuffling as students complied, desks scraping against stone floor, bags relocated to the perimeter of the room. Within minutes, there was a large open space in the center of the classroom, with students forming a loose circle around it. Now, Lupin said, standing in the center, I want you all to laugh. Silence. Uncomfortable, confused silence. Just laugh? Justin asked uncertainly. Just laugh. It doesn't have to be at anything. Just make the sound of laughter. Go on. A few tentative ha-ha sounds emerged from the braver students. They sounded painfully artificial, self-conscious. Several people giggled nervously at how awkward it was, which at least sounded more genuine. Louder, Lupin encouraged. Don't think about it. Just do it. Ha ha ha. See? Like that. Everyone together now. The class attempted it, a chorus of forced laughter that sounded like the world's worst amateur theater warm-up. It was so ridiculous that actual giggles started breaking through. The forced laughter began triggering real laughter at how forced it sounded, which made people laugh harder, which was funny in itself. Within 30 seconds, the fake laughter had transformed into something genuine. Students were laughing at each other, laughing at how absurd they all sounded, at Professor Lupin's theatrical demonstration of various types of laughter. The snort laugh, the silent shoulder-shaking laugh, the full belly laugh. Morgan found themselves laughing too, really laughing, the kind that made their stomach hurt and their eyes water. Hannah had a laugh, like a surprised hiccup, which made Susan laugh harder, which made Hannah laugh more. It became a feedback loop of genuine joy. Excellent, Lupin called out over the noise. Do you feel it? That's the energy we're looking for. That's what weakens dark magic and strengthens defensive spells. Hold on to that feeling. The laughter gradually subsided into breathless giggles and grins. The whole atmosphere of the classroom had changed. Lighter, warmer, more connected. Now, Lupin said, we're going to play a game. It's called Fortunately, Unfortunately. I'll demonstrate with a volunteer. Mr. Fletcher, would you help? Morgan's stomach tightened reflexively, being singled out, being the center of attention. But the room still buzzed with the warmth of shared laughter, and Professor Lupin's expression was nothing but encouraging. Morgan stepped forward. The game works like this, Lupin explained to the class. I'll start a story with an unfortunate event. Then Morgan will counter it with a fortunate development. We'll go back and forth, building a ridiculous narrative. The goal is to make each other and the class laugh. Ready, Morgan? Morgan nodded, not entirely sure what they'd agreed to. Right then, Lupin adopted a theatrical voice. Unfortunately, Mr. Fletcher woke up this morning to discover his wand had turned into a banana. A few snickers from the watching students. Morgan's mind raced, then landed on something. Fortunately, it was a magical banana that still cast spells. They just all smelled like fruit. Laughter bubbled up from the class. Lupin's eyes twinkled. Unfortunately, the fruit-scented spells attracted every owl in the owlery, and they followed him to breakfast. Fortunately, Morgan said, getting into the rhythm of it. The owls formed a protective circle around him, and everyone thought he'd become the new care of magical creatures professor. Louder laughter now. Morgan felt something loosening in their chest, the same feeling as facing the Boggart, but gentler, warmer, Unfortunately, Lupin continued, fighting his own smile. The actual care of magical creatures professor was offended and challenged him to a duel using only animal calls. Fortunately, Morgan had been secretly practicing hippogriff impressions and won the duel, becoming the youngest professor in Hogwarts history. The class was fully engaged now, laughing not just at the absurdity, but at how seriously both Lupin and Morgan were delivering each line. It went back and forth several more times. Unfortunately, the professorship came with a requirement to live in the Forbidden Forest. Fortunately, the centaurs threw him a welcome party. Unfortunately, the party music attracted a troll, until they were both laughing too hard to continue. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher," Lupin said, still grinning. 5 points to Hufflepuff for excellent comedic timing. "Everyone, get into groups of 4. You're going to play several rounds of this game. The goal isn't to be the funniest or the cleverest. It's to access that feeling of playful creativity, to practice finding joy even in the middle of unfortunate circumstances." The class divided into groups with enthusiastic chaos. Morgan found themselves with Hannah, Susan, and Ernie, a comfortable combination. "Right," Ernie said, taking charge as usual, but in a way that felt friendly rather than domineering. "Who wants to start?" "I will," Hannah offered. "Unfortunately, while brewing a pepper-up potion, I sneezed into the cauldron." "Fortunately," Susan jumped in, "it created a new potion that makes anyone who drinks it immune to all colds forever." "Unfortunately," Morgan added, "the potion also makes you speak only in rhyming couplets for 24 hours. "Fortunately," Ernie said with a grin, "this becomes the hottest new trend at Hogwarts, and everyone starts doing it deliberately." They continued, building increasingly ridiculous scenarios. Around them, other groups engaged in similar exercises. The room filled with laughter, groans at particularly terrible puns, the occasional burst of applause at an especially clever turn. Professor Lupin moved between groups, listening, occasionally joining in with a contribution that sent the whole group into fresh peals of laughter. Morgan discovered something interesting. The game made it impossible to stay self-conscious. There was no space for worrying about whether they were being boring or stupid or saying the wrong thing. The format demanded quick thinking and playful engagement, and every contribution, even the awkward ones, moved the story forward. Nothing was wrong. Everything added to the collective absurdity. After about 15 minutes of various improvisational games, fortunately, unfortunately, group story building, a particularly chaotic round of magical charades, Lupin called for attention. "Gather round, everyone," he said, and the students formed a loose circle again, still buzzing with energy. "How do you feel?" "Good," several people said simultaneously. "Energized," someone added. "Happy," Hannah said simply. "Exactly," Lupin said. "This is the state of being we're cultivating. This openness, this playfulness, this willingness to be silly and creative without self-consciousness. This is what makes defensive magic work. Not just technical skill, though that matters, but emotional and mental flexibility, the ability to access joy even in difficult circumstances." He looked around the circle, making eye contact with various students. Dark magic, fear-based magic, relies on rigidity, on narrowing your focus until all you can see is the threat. Defensive magic requires the opposite: expansion, flexibility, the ability to see multiple possibilities simultaneously. What you've been practicing today isn't just preparation for the ridiculous charm. It's preparation for any defensive magic you'll ever encounter. Morgan thought about the Boggart lesson, about the moment of standing frozen before their own fear made manifest. How different might that have felt with this kind of energy behind it, with the memory of genuine laughter, the practiced ability to find play even in stress. Now, Lupin said, a slight smile playing at his lips, I have a surprise. Or rather, a challenge. Who feels ready to face the Boggart again? The energy in the room shifted immediately, not quite to fear, but to heightened attention. Several hands went up, including Ernie's. Others hesitated. I'm not going to force anyone, Lupin clarified quickly, but I'm curious to see if, with this different energy, the experience might be different. More playful, perhaps, less terrifying. Anyone willing to try? Morgan's hand was rising before they'd consciously decided to raise it. Several students looked surprised. Morgan had been one of the more obviously shaken students during the original lesson. But something in Morgan felt different now, lighter. They wanted to know if it would feel different this time. Excellent, Lupin said softly, looking directly at Morgan. Mr. Fletcher, would you like to go first? The old Morgan would have panicked at this, would have immediately tried to back out. But the current Morgan, still warm with laughter and surrounded by classmates who'd spent the past half hour building ridiculous stories together, nodded. Yes, sir. I'd like to try. Lupin's smile was proud, knowing. Then let's see what happens when we face fear with joy instead of anxiety. He moved toward the wardrobe in the corner, wand ready, and the class formed a supportive circle around the cleared space. Morgan stepped into the center, and this time, they felt ready. Not unafraid, but ready. And somehow, that made all the difference. The wardrobe door opened with the same creak as before, but the sound felt different this time. Less ominous, more like the ordinary complaint of old hinges, the mundane protest of furniture being asked to do its job. The darkness inside remained just that, darkness, waiting, but not threatening. Morgan stood in the center of the cleared space, wand raised, and took a deliberate breath. Around them, their classmates formed a supportive circle. Not an audience this time, not judges waiting to evaluate performance. Just 20 students who'd spent the past half hour laughing together, building absurd stories, accessing the kind of playful energy that made magic feel possible rather than terrifying. Hannah caught Morgan's eye from the circle and smiled encouragingly. Susan gave a small thumbs up. Even Ernie nodded with what looked like genuine respect. The Boggart emerged slowly, a familiar rippling shapelessness seeking form. Morgan felt their heart rate increase. Fear hadn't disappeared entirely, probably never would, but alongside it was something else. Curiosity, perhaps. And underneath that, the lingering warmth of laughter, the memory of how good it had felt to be ridiculous and creative and fully present. The Boggart found its shape. Once again, it was Morgan standing alone in an endless corridor. The same closed doors, the same desperate calling out with no response, the same terrible isolation made visible. But something was different this time. Maybe it was Morgan's perspective, armed now with weeks of fear transformation practice. Maybe it was the residual energy of joy still humming through the classroom. Or maybe it was simply that Morgan had been here before, had survived this sight once already and knew what came next. The Boggart Morgan reached out with that same pleading gesture, mouth moving soundlessly. Morgan raised their wand, and this time the movement felt fluid, natural. Ridiculous. The transformation happened instantly. The corridor doors didn't just burst open. They transformed into doors of every ridiculous variety imaginable. A saloon door that swung back and forth. A grand cathedral door that was comically oversized. A tiny pet door at floor level. A revolving door that spun continuously. A door that was actually just a large picture frame with nothing behind it. And from each door came not just people in costumes, but a parade of absurdity that was even more elaborate than last time. There were house elves juggling dishes, portraits that had abandoned their frames to join the celebration, a suit of armor doing a little dance, several cats wearing tiny wizarding hats, the giant squid from the lake somehow squeezing through a door and waving a tentacle cheerfully. Even the Hogwarts ghost made an appearance, nearly headless Nick attempting to waltz with the Grey Lady. But the best part, the part that made Morgan's lips curve into a genuine smile, was that the Boggart Morgan in the center of it all looked absolutely overwhelmed. Not frightened, but comically besieged by friendship, like someone who'd wanted company and accidentally invited the entire castle to a party in a space meant for 3 people. Laughter erupted from the watching students, not polite chuckles or forced sounds, but real, delighted laughter at the sheer absurdity of the scene. The Boggart flickered, weakening under the onslaught of genuine joy. And this time, Morgan laughed too. Really laughed, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep and genuine. Because it was ridiculous. The exaggeration of never being alone taken to such an extreme that it became impossible to take seriously. And because underneath the absurdity was a truth that Morgan was beginning to accept, that the fear of isolation existed, but so did genuine connection. Both could be real. Fear didn't get to be the only narrator. Excellent. Professor Lupin's voice cut through the laughter. Absolutely excellent, Mr. Fletcher. Step back now. Morgan moved back to the circle, still grinning, and was immediately surrounded by quiet congratulations. Hannah squeezed their arm. Susan whispered, "That was brilliant." Several other students offered approving nods or smiles. The difference between this and the first Boggart lesson was stark. Then Morgan had stumbled back, feeling shaken, relieved it was over, but not quite triumphant. Now they felt energized, lighter, like they'd just won a small but significant victory. "Who's next?" Professor Lupin asked, and several hands shot up eagerly. The lesson continued with a parade of students, facing their fears with this new energy behind them. The transformations were more creative, more playful than the first time. The laughter came more easily, more genuinely. Susan turned her Boggart into a wanted poster seeking people guilty of excessive loyalty and radical friendship. Ernie's Boggart self in the jester costume now juggled its failing grades while riding a unicycle. Hannah's werewolf became a rabbit, attempting to teach other rabbits how to look fierce through a series of bunny-sized motivational posters. Each successful transformation built on the previous ones, the room's energy spiraling upward into something that felt almost celebratory. Even students who'd been nervous to volunteer found themselves raising hands, wanting to experience the difference between facing fear from a place of anxiety versus facing it from a place of playful confidence. Professor Lupin moved through it all with visible satisfaction, occasionally offering encouragement, but mostly letting the students discover their own capacity for joy-based magic. The wardrobe rattled less and less as the lesson progressed, the Boggart growing confused and weak from all the laughter, unable to maintain its menace in the face of so much genuine delight. Finally, after nearly everyone who wanted to had taken a turn, Lupin called for attention. The Boggart, thoroughly exhausted and flickering uncertainly between forms, was banished back into the wardrobe with a casual flick of Lupin's wand. He locked the door firmly. "Sit down, everyone," he said, and students shuffled back to their desks, still buzzing with residual energy. "Before you go, I want you to think about what was different this time. For those of you who faced the Boggart in both lessons, what changed?" Morgan's hand rose without hesitation. When Lupin nodded to them, they spoke clearly, the words coming easily. "The first time, I was afraid of being afraid, of failing, of embarrassing myself, of the fear itself. This time, I was curious, and I remembered that I could be creative, that there were dozens of ways to transform the fear. It felt more like a game than a test." "Precisely," Lupin said warmly. "The Boggart was the same. The fear it showed you was the same. But your relationship to that fear had changed. You'd practiced flexibility, practiced accessing joy, practiced being playful even with difficult emotions. That practice changed everything." He leaned against his desk, looking at each student thoughtfully. "This is what I want you to understand. Defensive magic isn't about being fearless. It's about being able to function well even when you're afraid. It's about having tools and practices that help you respond with creativity and courage rather than paralysis. What you learned today about laughter, about joy, about playfulness in the face of fear, this will serve you in every difficult situation you encounter. Not just with Boggarts or Dementors or dark creatures, but in life generally." Padma raised her hand. "Professor, what if we can't access that joyful feeling when we need it? What if we're too frightened?" "Then you practice," Lupin said simply, "the way you practice today. You train yourself in safe moments to access joy and laughter and playfulness. You build those neural pathways, make those responses automatic, so that when the frightening moment comes, your brain has a well-worn path to follow. It's like any other skill. The more you practice, the more reliable it becomes." He straightened, preparing to dismiss them. "Your essay for next class. I want you to identify 3 moments in your daily life where you could practice this kind of perspective shifting. Not grand moments, not life or death situations. Small things. A disappointing grade, an awkward social interaction, a frustrating setback. How could you transform your perspective on those moments? How could you find the absurd, the funny, the multiple truths instead of just the fearful narrative?" The bells chimed, signaling the end of the lesson. Students began gathering their things, conversations continuing as they prepared to leave. "Mr. Fletcher," Professor Lupin called, "could you stay back for a moment?" Morgan's stomach tightened reflexively. Being asked to stay after class usually meant trouble or concern. But Lupin's expression held only warmth as the other students filed out, Hannah and Susan shooting Morgan questioning looks that Morgan answered with a slight shrug. When the classroom had emptied, Lupin moved to sit on the edge of his desk, gesturing for Morgan to come closer. His posture was casual, non-threatening, more like a friendly conversation than an authority figure addressing a student. "I wanted to tell you," Lupin began, "how impressed I am with your progress. Not just magically, though your Boggart work today was exceptional, but personally, the change I've seen in you over these past few weeks has been remarkable." Morgan felt heat rise to their cheeks. "Thank you, sir. Your lessons helped a lot." "The lessons provided tools," Lupin said gently, "but you did the actual work. You chose to engage with the fear instead of avoiding it. You practiced perspective shifting even when it was uncomfortable. You let your friends support you. Those were all choices you made." He was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I recognize something in you, Morgan. The particular flavor of your fear, isolation, invisibility, the worry that connections aren't real. I've struggled with similar things." Morgan looked up, surprised. Professor Lupin, with his warm teaching style and obvious care for students, seemed like the last person who would understand fears of isolation. Lupin smiled slightly at Morgan's expression. "I have my own Boggart, you know, my own fears that I've had to learn to transform. And I've learned something important. The fears that tell us we're fundamentally alone, fundamentally unworthy of connection. Those fears are almost always lying. They're taking a small truth. That connection requires effort, that relationships can be complicated, and turning it into a catastrophic narrative where we're permanently isolated." He met Morgan's eyes directly, his expression serious but kind. "The truth is, you are seen. You are noticed. Your friends care about you genuinely, not out of obligation. The evidence has been there all along. You just needed to practice believing it." Morgan's throat felt tight. "How do you keep believing it? When the fear comes back?" "You practice," Lupin said, echoing his earlier advice to the class. "You remind yourself of the evidence. You choose connection even when fear says to withdraw. And you remember that fear is one voice, not the only voice. Some days will be easier than others. Some days the fear will feel overwhelming. But now you have tools. You know how to transform perspective. You know how to access joy even in difficult moments. You know you're not alone in this." He stood, moving to his desk to gather papers. "One more thing. That essay you wrote after the first Boggart lesson about fear not getting to have the final word, that was exceptional insight. I shared it, with your permission assumed, at a staff meeting. Several professors commented on the maturity of thought." Morgan blinked. "You did?" Professor McGonagall, in particular, was impressed. She said any student who can articulate complex emotional truths that clearly has a future in whatever field they choose. Lupin smiled. I agreed. You have a gift for understanding fear without letting it control you. That's rare, especially at your age. The praise felt overwhelming, almost too much. But underneath the embarrassment was something warm and steady. The recognition that they had, actually, learned something valuable, had grown in ways that were visible, not just to themselves, but to others. Thank you, Professor, Morgan managed, for everything. The lessons, the conversation, just understanding. It's my job to understand, Lupin said gently, and my privilege to watch students discover their own strength. Now off you go. Your friends are probably waiting for you, wondering what terrible thing you've done to warrant being held after class. Morgan laughed and headed for the door, but paused at the threshold. "Professor, what does your Boggart show you, if you don't mind me asking?" Lupin's expression flickered with something complicated. Not quite sadness, not quite fear, but something that encompassed both. "That's a story for another time, perhaps. But I'll tell you this. Even knowing what my Boggart shows, even having faced it many times, I still have to work to transform it. The fear doesn't disappear with knowledge or practice. We just get better at living alongside it." Morgan nodded, understanding more than words could convey, and headed out into the corridor. Hannah and Susan were waiting just outside, trying to look casual and failing entirely. "What was that about?" Susan asked immediately. "Are you in trouble? Did something happen?" Hannah's concern was evident. "No trouble," Morgan assured them. "He just wanted to talk about the lessons, about progress and stuff." "Good stuff," Hannah pressed. Morgan smiled, genuine, warm, the kind of smile that came from a place of actual happiness rather than social obligation. "Yeah, really good stuff." They walked together toward the great hall for dinner, the conversation flowing easily. Susan was explaining a complicated situation involving a Ravenclaw boy and a missed study date. Hannah was offering increasingly ridiculous theories about what had actually happened. Morgan contributed their own absurd suggestion that the boy had been kidnapped by house elves who needed help organizing the kitchens, and the three of them dissolved into laughter. The castle around them continued its ancient patterns. Portraits gossiped from their frames. Suits of armor hummed their haunting tunes. Ghosts drifted through walls on unknowable errands. The Halloween decorations cast flickering shadows that would have seemed ominous a few weeks ago, but now felt festive, playful, part of Hogwarts' particular charm. Morgan walked between friends who had sought them out, who chose to spend time with them, who laughed at their jokes and shared their concerns, and noticed when they were struggling. The evidence of connection that had always been there, but that Morgan was finally learning to trust. The fear hadn't disappeared. It still lived in the quiet spaces, still whispered its doubts in vulnerable moments. But now it had company, the memory of laughter, the practice of perspective shifting, the knowledge that fear was one voice among many. And increasingly, Morgan was learning to listen to the other voices too. That evening, sitting in the Hufflepuff common room with homework spread across low tables and the fire crackling warmly in the hearth, Morgan started the essay for Professor Lupin. 3 moments for practicing perspective shifting in daily life. Moment 1. When I worry that I'm bothering my friends by joining their study session, I can remember that they invited me, that they've been consistently inviting me, that their enjoyment seems genuine. The fear says I'm a burden. The evidence says I'm welcome. Both can exist, but I can choose which one to give more weight. Moment 2. When I lie awake at night catastrophizing about future isolation, I can remember the absurdity exercise. I can imagine the worst-case scenario, alone forever, and then add ridiculous elements, alone forever, but with a parade of overly friendly house elves, alone forever, but in a corridor where the portraits won't stop trying to give advice. The fear loses power when treated with playfulness. Moment 3. When I catch myself analyzing whether someone's kindness is real or obligatory, I can practice trust. I can accept the kindness at face value, can thank them genuinely, can reciprocate rather than interrogate. The fear says people are lying. Trust says People usually mean what they show. Both are possible, but trust builds connection while fear destroys it. Morgan paused, reading over what they'd written. It was honest, maybe more honest than Professor Lupin had expected. But honesty felt right. The whole point of these lessons had been about facing truth, both the truth of fear and the truth of what existed alongside fear. Across the common room, Hannah was falling asleep over her potions homework, head nodding dangerously close to an open inkwell. Susan was attempting to explain something to a first year who looked thoroughly confused. Ernie was holding court near the fire, telling an animated story that had several students laughing. Ordinary, normal. The everyday magic of people learning and growing and living together in a castle that had seen centuries of similar scenes. Morgan returned to their essay, and as they wrote about transformation and perspective and the choice to practice joy even in difficult moments, they felt something settle in their chest. Not the absence of fear, that would probably be a lifelong project, but the presence of something stronger, something that had been built through practice and choice, and the willingness to keep showing up even when it was scary. Hope, maybe, or courage, or simply the quiet knowledge that they could face the darkness and find light within it. Outside the rounded windows, night settled over Hogwarts. The Halloween feast approached. The Dementors still lurked beyond the grounds, a reminder that real dangers existed alongside the educational ones. But here, in this warm common room full of friends and firelight and the comfortable sounds of students at home, Morgan felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. Safe, connected, seen. The Boggart had shown them isolation, but Hogwarts, with its ghosts and portraits and suits of armor, its teachers who understood and friends who cared, its ancient magic of home and belonging, had shown them something different, had shown them that even darkness could be laughed away if you knew how to look at it right. And Morgan was learning, day by day, moment by moment, choice by choice. They were learning. The parchment lay finished on the common room table, ink drying in the firelight's warm glow. Morgan set down their quill and leaned back, feeling the pleasant weight of completion. The essay had taken longer than expected, not because the words were difficult to find, but because they'd wanted to get them right, to honor what Professor Lupin's lessons had actually meant, beyond just magical theory and defensive charms. Around them, the Hufflepuff common room had settled into its evening rhythms. The fire burned lower now, casting dancing shadows across copper and yellow hangings. A few dedicated students still worked at scattered tables, but most had drifted off to bed or gathered in quiet conversation near the warmth of the hearth. Hannah had finally given up on her potions homework and relocated to one of the squashy armchairs, a book of fairy tales open in her lap, the kind with moving illustrations that acted out the stories in miniature. Susan sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, teaching that confused first year the proper wand movement for the levitation charm. Her patience endless and genuine. Morgan watched them for a moment. These friends who had become something more than just dormitory mates or study partners. People who noticed absences and offered comfort, who sought them out and welcomed them in, who'd stood in that defense classroom and laughed alongside them, creating the kind of magic that didn't require wands at all. The evidence of connection, Penelope Clearwater had called it. Professor Lupin had said it was always there, waiting to be believed. Morgan was learning to believe it. "Finished?" Susan asked, glancing up from her tutoring session. "Just now," Morgan confirmed, carefully rolling the parchment. "Good essay." "Honest essay," Morgan said, which felt like a better description. "I think Professor Lupin will appreciate that." Hannah looked up from her fairy tales, a small smile on her face. "You've been different lately. Lighter, somehow. It's nice to see." Morgan considered the observation, finding truth in it. The fear hadn't vanished. It still whispered its doubts in quiet moments, still painted catastrophes in the space between waking and sleep. But it had been joined by other voices now. The memory of laughter turning darkness absurd. The knowledge that perspective could be shifted, transformed, chosen deliberately. The understanding that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The Boggart lessons helped, Morgan said simply. Learning that fear doesn't get to write the only story. "That's quite profound for this late in the evening," Susan said with gentle teasing. "Save some wisdom for tomorrow." They laughed, easy, comfortable laughter that filled the space without effort. The first year Susan had been helping finally succeeded in levitating their quill, which prompted a small celebration and several congratulatory high fives. Morgan gathered their things, preparing to head up to the dormitory. But they paused at the base of the stairs, looking back at the common room one more time, at the fire still burning despite the late hour, maintained by house elves' invisible care, at the portraits on the walls, some sleeping, others chatting quietly amongst themselves, at the plants Professor Sprout had gifted to their common room, thriving in the yellow-tinged light, at the students scattered throughout, some working, some resting, all belonging to this particular corner of Hogwarts, where loyalty and hard work were celebrated alongside kindness and community. Home, Morgan thought. This was what home felt like. Not the absence of fear or difficulty or struggle, not perfection or constant happiness, but rather a place where fears could be faced and transformed, where darkness existed but so did warmth, where isolation whispered its lies but connection offered truth, a place where even Boggarts could be laughed at, where the worst fears could wear tutus and ride unicycles, where the deepest anxieties could be met with ridiculous conga lines of costume-wearing well-wishers. "Coming up," Hannah called from halfway up the stairs, book tucked under her arm. "Right behind you," Morgan replied. They climbed the stairs together, Susan joining them after saying goodnight to her first-year student. The dormitory welcomed them with familiar comfort. 4 poster beds with their heavy curtains, trunks holding treasured possessions, the small personal touches that made the space theirs. Through the round window, Morgan could see the ground stretching dark beyond the castle, the forbidden forest a distant shadow against the star-scattered sky. Somewhere out there, real dangers existed, dementors still patrolled, dark magic still lurked in forgotten corners. The world held genuine threats that couldn't simply be laughed away with a clever charm. But here, in this moment, Morgan felt ready for whatever came next. Not fearless, that was neither possible nor desirable, but equipped, armed with perspective shifting and practiced joy, surrounded by friends who chose connection, guided by teachers who understood that the greatest magic often came from the simplest truths, that fear and courage could coexist, that isolation and connection were both possible, but connection was worth choosing, that even in the darkest moments, if you knew how to look, light could be found. Morgan changed into pajamas, tucked the finished essay carefully into their bag for tomorrow's class, and climbed into bed. The curtains closed around them, creating a small world of soft darkness and warm blankets. Through the fabric, they could hear Hannah and Susan's quiet conversation, the comfortable sounds of friends settling into sleep. The fear tried one more time, whispered that this could all disappear, that connection was temporary, that isolation was inevitable. But Morgan smiled into the darkness and thought of conga lines and dancing suits of armor and the absurd parade of friendliness that fear could become with the right perspective. Thought of Professor Lupin's understanding eyes and Penelope's practical wisdom and the evidence that had been there all along, waiting to be trusted. Ridiculous, Morgan thought, and the fear shrank just a little more. Outside, Hogwarts continued its ancient watch, the castle that had sheltered countless students through centuries of fears and triumphs, losses and victories, darkness and light, the school that taught magic in all its forms, not just spells and potions, but courage and friendship and the transformative power of choosing hope, even when fear seemed easier. And within its walls, a second-year Hufflepuff drifted towards sleep, carrying the knowledge that tomorrow they would wake surrounded by friends, would attend classes where they belonged, would face whatever challenges arose with the tools they'd been given and the courage they'd practiced, that even darkness could be laughed away, that fear didn't get to have the final word, that home was real and connection was possible, and they were not, had never been, truly alone. The fire in the common room below burned low but steady, maintained through the night by magic both practical and profound. And in dormitories throughout the castle, students slept and dreamed, each carrying their own fears and hopes, each learning in their own way that Hogwarts offered more than just education in spells and charms. It offered something deeper, something that couldn't be found in textbooks or taught through lectures alone. It offered the magic of belonging, the transformation of fear through laughter, the courage to face darkness and find light within it. And for Morgan Fletcher, lying warm and safe in a 4-poster bed in Hufflepuff Tower, surrounded by the quiet breathing of friends and the ancient comfort of a castle that felt like home, that was the most powerful magic of all.